Imagine this. You are Lady Isabella de Clare, standing in the cold stone corridor of Dover Castle in the year 1205. Your husband, the legendary William Marshal, is away defending the king's territories in France. A royal messenger has just arrived, bearing a sealed letter with King John's personal signet. Your hands tremble as you break the wax seal, not from cold, but from the knowledge that every woman of your station shares. When King John sends a private message to a nobleman's wife while her husband is absent, it is never about estate management or political alliance. The parchment contains what the messenger calls a request for you to attend the king privately at his hunting lodge in the New Forest. But you have heard the whispered warnings from other noblewomen in darkened castle solars. You know what happened to Lady de Vesey when she refused a similar invitation. You understand that the word request means something entirely different when it comes from a king who answers to no law and no man. The messenger watches your face carefully, waiting for your response, and you can see in his eyes that he already knows what you will say. Because in John's England, there is only one answer a noblewoman can give when the king expresses his desire. The question is not whether you will comply, but what price your family will pay either way. Think the medieval period was all about chivalry and courtly love? Think knights protecting ladies and kings bound by honor? The reality of King John's reign from 1199 to 1216 was so twisted, so systematically predatory toward noblewomen, that it makes modern power abuse scandals look almost quaint by comparison. What you are about to discover is not just about one bad king. It is about how absolute power operated in medieval England, how noblewomen became instruments of political control through intimate coercion, and how the crimes committed in royal chambers helped spark the rebellion that gave us Magna Carta. The chronicles tried to bury this truth. The official records used careful euphemisms, but the evidence survived in scattered monastic writings, in family histories passed down through generations, and in the suspicious gaps in royal documents that reveal more than any direct accusation. The system King John created was not about passion or even lust in the conventional sense. It was about power expressed through the most intimate violation possible. When you understand how this worked, you will see medieval politics in an entirely different light. His chronicle reads like an administrative record, but between the lines, a pattern emerges. Women whose husbands opposed the king were summoned to court. Women whose families controlled strategic territories were invited to royal hunting lodges. Women whose beauty was remarked upon in courtly circles found themselves recipients of royal attention they never sought. The chronicler uses phrases like detained for her own protection or remained in the king's household as his guest. But these were prisons with silk curtains. The women knew it. Their families knew it. And King John knew that they knew, which made the coercion even more effective as a tool of political control. But here is what the official chronicles could not fully hide. When families resisted, when noblewomen or their relatives dared to refuse the king's advances, John did not simply move on to more willing targets. He made examples. The most documented and horrifying case involved Matilda de Braos, the wife of William de Braos, one of John's most powerful barons. In 1208, William de Braos fled England rather than hand over his sons as hostages to guarantee his loyalty. But Matilda and her eldest son William were not fast enough to escape. Royal forces captured them and brought them before King John. What happened next was recorded by the Margam Abbey Annals with unusual specificity for medieval chronicles, suggesting the monks wanted this crime remembered even if they had to be careful about direct accusation. Matilda de Braos made a fatal mistake in King John's presence. When questioned about why her husband fled rather than provide hostages, she reportedly said that she would not deliver her children to a king who had murdered his own nephew. She was referring to Arthur of Brittany, John's rival for the throne, who had disappeared while in John's custody in 1203. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood that Matilda had just signed her own death warrant, but what form that death would take revealed the particular cruelty of John's character. He did not order immediate execution, which would have been almost merciful by medieval standards. Instead, Matilda and her son were taken to Windsor Castle and later transferred to Corfe Castle in Dorset. There, in the year 1210, they were placed in the dungeon and simply forgotten. No food was brought. No water was provided. The castle guards had orders to ignore any sounds from below. The Margam Abbey Chronicle records that they survived for 11 days. 11 days of absolute darkness, of hunger that progresses from discomfort to agony to delirium. 11 days of a mother watching her son die slowly, knowing that her words of defiance had condemned them both. When the guards finally opened the dungeon, they found Matilda's body positioned as if she had been trying to consume pieces of her son's cheeks after he died, driven mad by starvation. The chronicler includes this detail not for sensationalism, but as evidence of the extremity of their suffering. This was not a quick execution. This was torture designed to send a message to every noble family in England. This is what happens when you refuse the king. This is what happens when you speak truths he wants hidden. This is what happens when you deny him anything he wants, whether that be political loyalty or intimate access to the women of your family. The death of Matilda de Braos marked a turning point in how King John's contemporaries viewed him. Even by medieval standards, where power was often brutal and life was cheap, starving a noblewoman and her son to death over 11 days was seen as excessive, as evidence of a king whose cruelty had no bounds. But here is what makes this truly chilling. Matilda's death was not primarily about her defiance regarding hostages. It was about her knowledge of what King John did to women he desired. Several sources suggest that Matilda herself had been the target of royal attention, that her fierce loyalty to her husband and her public defiance stemmed from personal experience of John's predatory behavior. She died not just for political opposition, but for refusing to be silent about the king's intimate crimes. Now that you have witnessed how King John punished one woman who dared refuse him, you are beginning to see the patterns hidden in medieval court politics. What you have discovered so far is merely the surface of John's systematic exploitation of noble women. The deeper we go, the more twisted this becomes. If uncovering these buried truths about how power actually operated in medieval England resonates with your hunger for real history, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. You are about to learn something that will fundamentally change how you understand the causes of Magna Carta and the nature of medieval royal power. Because what comes next will reveal that Matilda de Braos was not an isolated case. She was one example of a system John had perfected over years of ruling without meaningful constraint. The hostage system that medieval kings used was theoretically about ensuring loyalty through leverage. A baron would provide his son or close relative to live at court as a guarantee of good behavior. But King John transformed this into something far more sinister. He specifically demanded daughters and wives, not sons. He insisted that noble families send their most beautiful female relatives to be part of the royal household. The official explanation was always the same: for their protection, to ensure their education in courtly manners, to honor them with proximity to the throne. But everyone understood the real purpose. These women were held not as political hostages in the traditional sense, but as a harem of noble captives from whom the king could select according to his desires. The patent rolls and close rolls from John's reign, the official administrative records, contain dozens of entries demanding that specific noblewomen be brought to court. The language is bureaucratic and formal, but the pattern is unmistakable. In 1209, John demanded that Gwladys Fyrch Llywelyn, daughter of the Welsh prince Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, be handed over as part of a treaty. She was 13 years old. The official record states she was held at Windsor Castle for her safety during negotiations. She remained in John's household for 3 years. What happened during those 3 years is not explicitly recorded in any surviving document, but later Welsh chronicles referred to her time in captivity with phrases that suggest profound trauma. When she was finally released as part of a later treaty, she was immediately married to Reginald de Braose, son of the William de Braose whose wife John had starved to death. The speed of this marriage, arranged by her father, suggests an attempt to restore her honor through a formal union, which implies that her honor had been compromised during her captivity. Margaret de Clare, another noblewoman from one of England's most powerful families, found herself summoned to the royal court in 1214. Her husband was away on military service in France, a common pattern. The close rolls record her arrival at the King's Hunting Lodge in Clarendon Forest with unusual specificity, noting the exact date and even the time of day. This level of detail was not standard for administrative records unless something significant occurred that officials wanted documented for their own protection. Margaret remained at court for 6 weeks. When she returned to her husband's estates, she brought with her a royal charter granting significant lands to her family. Medieval noblewomen did not typically negotiate land grants. The timing and unusual nature of this transaction suggests a payment, compensation for something that could not be named directly in official records. Her husband, upon returning from France, immediately joined the growing rebellion against King John, despite having been previously loyal. Family chronicles passed down through the de Clare lineage contain oblique references to a great wrong done to our ancestress by the tyrant king, but the specifics were apparently too shameful to record explicitly even in private family documents. The pattern repeats across dozens of noble families. Women were summoned while husbands were away on royal business. They remained at court for weeks or months. They returned with either royal grants suggesting compensation or with their families immediately turning against the king. The Barnwell Chronicle, written by a monk who had access to courtly information, notes that many of the barons who eventually rebelled in 1215 did so because of private grievances not suitable for public discussion. This is medieval chronicler code for intimate crimes. The monk could not directly accuse a king of systematic predation, but he could hint that the political rebellion had personal, shameful causes that the participants themselves did not want publicly examined. What makes this system particularly horrifying is how John used the legal and social structures of medieval society to make resistance nearly impossible. A noblewoman who refused a royal summons was technically defying a direct command from her sovereign. This was treason. Her husband, if he supported her refusal, would have his lands confiscated and could be imprisoned or executed. If a woman went to court and then later accused the king of improper behavior, she had no legal standing. Women could not testify against men in most circumstances, and certainly not against the king. Even if her family believed her, what could they do? Rebel against the most powerful man in the kingdom based on an accusation that would destroy their daughter's reputation, even in the telling? The system was perfectly designed to ensure silence and compliance. The wife of Eustace de Vesey provides another documented case that illuminates how this worked. In 1212, rumors spread through the court that King John had attempted to seduce de Vesey's wife during one of her required appearances at court. The exact nature of the interaction was never recorded, but de Vesey immediately joined a conspiracy to assassinate the king. The plot was discovered, and de Vesey fled to Scotland. Matthew Paris, writing his Chronica Majora several decades later with access to insider testimony from survivors of John's reign, states explicitly that de Vesey's motivation was personal dishonor inflicted by the king upon his household. This is as close as a medieval chronicler could come to directly accusing a king of attempted or completed assault against a noblewoman. De Vesey never returned to England during John's lifetime and died in exile. His wife's fate is not recorded, which itself is telling. Noble ladies who featured in scandals involving the king often disappeared from the historical record as if their families wanted no reminder of what had occurred. But here is where it gets truly disturbing. King John did not just exploit individual women as opportunities arose. He actively sought out information about which noblemen had beautiful wives or daughters. He maintained what we might now call a targeting list. The Barnwell Chronicle mentions that the king employed informants throughout his kingdom who would report on notable beauties among the nobility. When John traveled through his territories, he would arrange to meet the families of women who had been described to him. These were not chance encounters. They were planned operations where the king would manufacture reasons to separate the woman from her family temporarily, often requesting private audiences to discuss matters of estate management or to convey royal favor. During these private meetings, women faced the impossible situation of being alone with a man who was both their sovereign and a predator with absolute legal immunity. The economic dimension added another layer of coercion. If a noblewoman refused the king's advances and her husband supported her resistance, John would find pretexts to confiscate their lands. The charter rolls show dozens of properties seized during John's reign for offenses like failure to pay debts to the crown, where the amounts owed were suddenly and drastically increased, or for technical violations of feudal obligations that had been ignored for years. In many cases, the targeted families were those where women had reportedly rebuffed royal attention. The message was clear to all noble families: deny the king his desires and lose everything. Your choice is between your wife's honor and your children's inheritance. Most families, faced with this impossible decision, chose survival. They sent their women to court. They looked away. They told themselves that serving the king's pleasure was a form of royal favor, a twisted honor that came with material rewards and political protection. The mental gymnastics required to live with this shame is almost incomprehensible to modern minds. What is most chilling about reviewing the documentary evidence is recognizing how carefully everyone avoided directly stating what was happening. The chronicles use euphemisms. The official records document movements and transactions, but never motives. The family histories passed down through generations speak of wrongs and dishonors, but rarely specify details. This silence was not accidental. It was enforced through a combination of legal vulnerability, social shame, and the sheer power imbalance between a king and his subjects. But the silence itself becomes evidence when you see the pattern across hundreds of documents. Why do so many noblewomen appear in court records during their husbands' absences? Why do so many families receive sudden royal grants after their female relatives spend time in the royal household? Why did so many previously loyal barons suddenly join the rebellion in 1215 despite having supported John for years? When you cannot find direct accusations in medieval sources, you look for the shapes of what is missing. And what is missing from John's reign is any plausible, innocent explanation for these patterns. The rebellion that forced King John to sign Magna Carta in 1215 is usually taught as being about taxation, about feudal rights, about the king's military failures in France. These were certainly factors. But the intimate crimes committed against noblewomen and their families were equally important in driving the barons to armed resistance. This is not speculation. Matthew Paris records that among the private grievances motivating the rebels were matters of family honor, too sensitive to include informal demands. The Barnwell chronicler states that some barons fought not for political principles, but to avenge personal wrongs inflicted by the king. Even Magna Carta itself contains curious provisions that make more sense when you understand this hidden context. Clause 54 states that no one shall be arrested or imprisoned on the appeal of a woman for the death of anyone except her husband. This oddly specific clause suggests that there were cases where women had tried to testify about deaths, possibly suspicious deaths, of family members who resisted the king. And this testimony was being used to imprison people who protected those women or supported their accusations. What survived in the historical record about King John's treatment of noblewomen is almost certainly only a fraction of what actually occurred. Medieval chroniclers had to be extremely careful about accusations against royal figures. They developed a language of insinuation and euphemism. When a chronicler writes that a lady was detained at the king's pleasure, medieval readers understood the double meaning. When records show a noblewoman spending weeks at a royal hunting lodge with no other women present, contemporaries knew what this signified. The gaps in official records where women's names suddenly disappear often indicated shame so great that families wanted no reminder. Sometimes women were sent to convents not for religious reasons, but to hide pregnancies or to remove them from public view after traumatic experiences at court. The Coggeshall Chronicle, written by an abbot in Essex with connections to multiple noble families, contains several passages that read like coded testimony. He describes how certain families came to prefer the death of the king over any peaceful resolution of political conflicts. He notes that some of the barons who fought most viciously against John in the Civil War leading up to Magna Carta had been previously moderate in their politics, suggesting that something deeply personal had radicalized them. In one revealing passage, he writes that the king had made enemies of men who should have been his strongest supporters by crimes that good Christians dare not speak of plainly. This is as close as a medieval monk could come to accusing a king of systematic intimate violence against noblewomen. The very structure of the sentence, with its acknowledgement that speaking plainly about these crimes is impossible for good Christians, reveals the social mechanisms that enforce silence around royal predation. When King John died in 1216, there was no public mourning among the noble families he had ruled. Within a generation, there was a deliberate effort to erase the most shameful aspects of his reign. The official histories focused on political and military events. They portrayed the rebellion as being about abstract principles of law and governance. The intimate crimes that had motivated many of the rebels were allowed to fade into euphemism and eventually into silence. But families remembered. The descendants of women who had been held hostage in John's household carried these stories forward, even when they could not be written down. Deathbed confessions from elderly courtiers who had served in John's household, recorded decades after his death when the political danger had passed, contain fragmentary references to what they witnessed. An unnamed knight, confessing to a priest in the 1240s, reportedly stated that he had seen things in the king's private chambers that haunted his conscience, things he had been powerless to prevent because the king's will was law. The priest recorded this confession anonymously in his records, but preserved the testimony as evidence of the corruption of earthly power. Another courtier, confessing on his deathbed in the 1250s, asked forgiveness for remaining silent when he should have spoken, for valuing his own position and safety over the honor and safety of noble ladies who had no one to protect them from the king. These fragmentary testimonies, scattered across monastic archives, form a devastating mosaic of systematic abuse protected by absolute power. You came into this story knowing King John as the villain who signed Magna Carta under pressure from rebellious barons. Now you leave understanding that his crimes against noblewomen were so systematic, so protected by the absolute nature of royal power, that they helped spark the rebellion that changed English law forever. The political principles enshrined in Magna Carta about limiting royal authority were not abstract philosophical developments. They grew directly from the lived experience of families who had seen their wives and daughters used as instruments of royal pleasure and political control. If this journey through hidden medieval testimony has awakened your appetite for the history that textbooks will not teach, subscribing means you will continue accessing these revelations about how power really worked in the past. While others know the sanitized version of Magna Carta as a document about taxes and feudal rights, you will understand that it was also about protecting families from a king who recognized no limits on his desires. The story of King John and the noblewomen he exploited is ultimately about power and the courage it takes to resist power even when resistance seems impossible. The women whose names appear briefly in chronicles before disappearing had no legal recourse, no way to publicly accuse their abuser without destroying their own reputations and their families' futures. Yet some still resisted. Matilda de Braos spoke truth to power, even knowing it would cost her life. The families who joined the rebellion, despite the personal shame involved, chose justice over silence. Their resistance helped create the legal and political framework that would eventually develop into modern concepts of human rights and dignity. We owe them recognition not just for their suffering, but for their refusal to accept that suffering as inevitable or acceptable.